Hello Internet, welcome to my channel. I'm Chameleon X, and one of my all-time favorite video game franchises is the Fallout series. I got into this post-apocalyptic role-playing game back when New Vegas was just released. My DM at the time, Steve, was playing it at his house while we were waiting for the other players to get there, and he let me take a turn. I wasn't very good at it, of course, but it still stuck in my mind as an interesting experience. After discovering that New Vegas was a sequel to the previous title, Fallout 3, I decided to start with that game first, and I was instantly hooked. The atmosphere of the Fallout series, diving into abandoned buildings, fighting irradiated monsters, exploring the ruins of a world destroyed by nuclear war, was like nothing I'd ever seen before. It wasn't long before I started imagining what it would be like to actually live and have to survive in that world. Much like with the Elder Scrolls series, there's been no shortage of attempts to convert the Fallout setting into a tabletop RPG. There have been official or almost official attempts to license the Fallout franchise in the past, and in more recent years, another TTRPG adaptation of the franchise was released for the 2D20 system. But on this channel, we focus on 5e Dungeons & Dragons, so assuming we don't want to bother plunking down more time and money on a whole new set of core rulebooks, how do we go about modding the 5th edition D&D rule set to make it run more like a Fallout game? That is what this video is going to cover. In this first installment, I'm going to go over a few of the core assumptions of the Fallout universe and explain how we can simulate these in a game of Dungeons & Dragons. What optional rules and pre-written content can we use to create an adventure, or even a whole campaign set in the world of Fallout? What house rules or custom content do we need to come up with to patch up the holes where the two systems don't quite mesh? That's what we're here to find out. The most important thing to get right about the Fallout setting isn't mechanics, but rather its tone. The Fallout universe is a complex mixture of paranoia, escapism, horror, political satire, fatalism, and dark comedy that is very difficult to distill down into a single formula. At its core, Fallout is about the paradox of the human condition. As a species, we seem to be constantly at war with ourselves, in both a literal and metaphorical sense. On an individual level, we're driven by a desire for peace, companionship, comfort, joy, and pleasure. But the pursuit of these things often leads us down a dark path of death, destruction, pain, and misery. Everyone has their own perspective, and reality is almost never as simple as black and white or good and evil. We see these themes repeated over and over in the Fallout series. The vast majority of antagonists that we fight against in the games are people or organizations with a vision for humanity. The Master, the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel, Caesar's Legion, the Institute, all of them genuinely believe that what they're doing is for the greater good, and in most cases you can see how their logic leads them to that conclusion, even if you don't agree with them. So when you're planning your Fallout adventure, you should consider presenting your players with these kinds of moral dilemmas. Give them quests where the easiest way to complete it is to just be a dick, and doing the right thing is an active choice that requires extra effort and greater risk. Have the villains they encounter give them reasonable arguments for why their evil plan is actually good for the Wasteland, and be prepared for what happens if your PCs actually agree and decide to join them. The trick is to make their moral decisions count. Have their choice actually be a choice. Don't just present a cartoonishly evil option as an afterthought because A, that cheapens the stakes and kills the drama for the players, and B, there is a statistically significant chance that your players will choose that option just to see what happens. Another theme of the Fallout series is the conflict between holding on to the past or letting it go. The Great War presented a golden opportunity for human civilization to start over from scratch, and many factions have done just that, focusing their efforts on creating a new civilization from the ground up, while not necessarily caring all that much about what happened before the war. Others, however, are seemingly focused on reclaiming the lost glory of the pre-war era. Rather than looking forward, their goal is to return to the past. The New California Republic is founded on the principles of the America that was, democracy, capitalism, and the rule of law. But in following the example of the pre-war USA, Fallout New Vegas makes it clear that the NCR has started duplicating some of the bad habits that led to America's downfall. The Enclave seeks to reshape America into their idealized version of what the nation should be, even if it means burning down what the survivors have built in its place. Caesar's Legion and the Brotherhood of Steel both reject the old world as corrupt and decadent while still being inescapably chained to it, each in their own way. Factions like the Institute and Mr. House seemingly ignore the past entirely and focus only on humanity's future, each ignoring the horrors of the world outside their little bubble and caring only for how events in the wasteland affect their own goals. Most people who aren't part of a specific faction, like the citizens of settlements like Diamond City or Megaton, generally don't care much about the past or the future, as they're just worried about surviving the day-to-day. If you create new factions for your Fallout game, consider how each of them differs in their perspective about the Great War and how the world should progress beyond it. Are they nostalgic for the pre-war era, or do they seek to distance themselves from it? What aspects of the old world do these factions preserve and advocate for, and what parts of it do they reject or vilify? How do they interact with other factions, including those from the established lore? If the faction is able to prevail, what consequences would it have for the wasteland and all of the people who live in it? Does the faction attempt to aid the people living in the here and now, or is their ideology focused on a bigger picture view that discounts the day-to-day struggles of wastelanders? One other important aspect of the Fallout universe is its satirical approach to presenting the horrors of the post-apocalypse. Even though things can get pretty dark in Fallout, there are also lighthearted or downright silly moments scattered here and there to make the players stop and laugh. Even if you're doing a hardcore survival campaign, don't be afraid to drop in something weird like a pre-war skeleton that clearly died in a compromising position, or poke fun at the Red Scare propaganda, out-of-control capitalism, and hilariously antiquated 50s sitcom-type cultural norms of the setting. Also, if you set your adventure in your hometown, you can add cheeky references to things your players might recognize, just for a laugh. Now, there are some aspects of the Fallout universe that are pretty compatible with a vanilla D&D experience. Like in most campaign settings, the storyline of the Fallout franchise takes place in the aftermath of some kind of cataclysm that left most of the world an untamed wilderness with only scattered bastions of civilization dotted across the monster-infested landscape. After all, this is the easiest way to justify roaming bands of mercenaries going around killing animals and looting abandoned buildings without getting fined or arrested. In fact, when you really stop to think about it, Faerun is kind of like a fantasy version of a post-apocalypse. Most of the great empires of the past have fallen into ruins, and much of the gameplay of a standard D&D campaign is delving into forgotten towers, buried cities, and other crumbling remnants of the world's past glories, while most people in the current day live in relatively low-tech agrarian societies that are in constant peril from raiders, monsters, and so forth. The wallpaper is different, but the basic themes are pretty much the same. In fact, you might even be able to turn some of the official adventures into a Fallout campaign with a moderate dose of reskinning. If you don't want to make up an adventure map from scratch, I'd say the best adventures to do this with would probably be Curse of Strahd or Descent into Avernus, or maybe look back at some of the 2nd edition Dark Sun or Ravenloft modules. These options all have the same desperate, surviving against the odds feel to them. Also, Baldur's Gate has tanks and motorcycles powered by damned souls, so there's that. Okay, so if we're confident enough in our DMing skills to build a Fallout campaign, we're probably reasonably familiar with quest and world design. So what about the nuts and bolts? Well, much like the Elder Scrolls series, there isn't too much of a problem translating Fallout's special system to the 6 ability scores in D&D. Once again, each score has a pretty direct analog, with only the luck stat being an outlier. Since the function of this stat is basically covered by the act of rolling dice, we can probably just ignore luck. Though, as an alternate method, I was considering using the proficiency dice variant rule from the Dungeon Master's Guide, and then having any effect that modifies luck just change the size of the proficiency dice. I haven't incorporated this into my rules as of yet, since there's so many moving parts already, and I didn't want to introduce too many house rules until I work out the kinks. Anyway, for any effect that raises or lowers a character's special stats, we should probably just keep things simple and use advantage and disadvantage. Now, one major house rule I'm working on is incorporating VATs into the game as an alternate method of determining hits. I might alter the way this works after getting more playtest data, but how I'm ruling it thus far is that synths or players equipped with a Pip-Boy can spend an action point when taking the attack action to make a percentile roll instead of a normal attack roll. The base chance is 50% plus their ability mod, and they have the option of targeting specific parts of the enemy's body, just like in the Fallout games. Their choice of target, as well as other factors like range range, visibility, and whether or not their own limbs are crippled alter this base accuracy if the dice roll under the target number the player hits. Each time they score a successful hit, they earn points toward banking a critical hit, like in Fallout 4. Once they gain enough points, they can apply an automatic crit to any attack of their choice that they make in VATS, which automatically hits. No need to roll. If they target a specific body part, that appendage is given a certain percentage of the creature's total hit points, and if they cause more damage than that, limb becomes crippled, inflicting a lasting injury. Crippled limbs can only be healed by using a doctor's bag or by a long rest. Another important house rule is radiation, as this is a huge factor in the Fallout universe. The simplest approach would be to just have rads impose levels of exhaustion, and I included this option in the PDF I'm writing to go that route. However, I decided to go the extra mile and make my own rad poisoning table. Just like exhaustion, there are 6 levels, and if you reach level 6, you die! However, I made the effects of gaining rads slightly different than exhaustion, and mostly focused on reducing your health and healing abilities, as in Fallout 4. I did it this way so that it's possible to stack levels of exhaustion with rad poisoning if your players really screw the pooch, but I'll have to see how this approach works out in my upcoming games. Now, I mentioned action points earlier. This is a variation of the hero point system from page 264 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. Like hero points, an action point in my game will basically be a d6 you can add on to any d20 roll to affect the outcome. The difference is that action points are recovered on a shorter long rest, and you only get a number of them equal to a proficiency bonus, and you can also spend them to use VATS, use a stim pack or dash as a bonus action, or make a perception or investigation check as a bonus action. I'm planning on adding more abilities to the game that also add more uses for action points, but for now I'd figured I'd keep things simple and see how it works out. Other variant rules I'm including are encumbrance from the player's handbook, and taking a long rest doesn't automatically restore all your hit points. Instead, you must spend hit dice during a long rest, as you can no longer spend them during a short rest. And since you only regain half your hit dice from each long rest, that means combat is much more dangerous than it is in vanilla 5e, especially since I'm also using the suggestions for firearms in the DMG, and making pretty much all guns do 2 dice of damage on a hit. To kind of offset this, I'm making damage reduction a standard thing that all armor in the game gets, and various other game elements will also offer stacking DR bonuses. Taking a cue from New Vegas Hardcore mode and Fallout 4's survival difficulty, I'm also increasing the hunger and thirst requirements from the player's handbook to double their normal value. Most water sources in the wasteland will be contaminated, and players drinking unpurified water will have to make a con save or risk contracting a disease from it. Likewise with uncooked food or melee attacks from wasteland animals. Finally, I'm adding an equipment degradation system so that my players will have to maintain and repair their equipment or it will break and become useless. The exact HP values of the different items is likely going to change with playtesting, so at the moment they're pretty tentative. On the positive side, I'm adding a house rule that lets you dual-wield one-handed firearms, as by raw, you can technically only do 2-weapon fighting with melee weapons. I'm giving proficiency with simple firearms to all classes, just flat out, as pretty much anyone can figure out how to use a gun. Those classes that have proficiency with all martial weapons have proficiency with martial firearms as well. I'll talk more about guns when I make a video about the equipment section. Finally, I decided to just replace the Arcana skill with Science, so every class that was proficient in Arcana is now proficient in Science, and every effect in D&D that gives you proficiency in Arcana also gives you proficiency with Science. It's that simple. The Science skill will also allow players to hack computers. Yes, I'm going to try to incorporate the hacking minigame into my adventure. I'm just not quite sure how yet. If you have any suggestions, put them in the comments. Now, the simplest approach here would be to just have everyone play a human. In the Fallout universe, like 98% of the people you encounter are human, or at least they used to be. There really aren't any other races in the fantasy trope sense, unless you count talking Deathclaws and borderline self-aware robots. I was going to restrict my players to just humans, but the urge to make up stats for ghouls and super mutants was too hard to fight, so that's ultimately what I did. Between all of my players, I'm going to have at least one person playtesting each of these races, so I'll be able to figure out whether or not I need to tweak any of their features. Right off the bat, I'm worried that not having to eat or drink might derail a lot of the tension in the campaigns, even more so than the immunity to radiation, but we'll have to see. I might be able to work around that due to the fact that everyone in the party has different needs, so they still have a reason to not just sit around and play Caravan all day. If you think you might have trouble with that, or if you just really want to focus on the survival aspect, it's perfectly reasonable to just straight up ban any race except human. As for the classes, I'm going to make a dedicated video going over the various things I made up, probably after I get some playtest data to compare them to. I originally considered trying my hand at making a classless system like the official Fallout TTRPGs use, or else a more generic hero variant like they have in the D20 Modern. Ultimately, though, I decided this would be too much work for too little payoff, and besides, the existing character class system in 5th edition is more than adequate for a Fallout campaign to function properly with some minor tweaks. So instead, I just added a bunch of variant features to patch some holes in the existing classes and enable more Fallout-style build options, and then I focused on making a subclass for each of the classes that I thought would make sense in the Fallout universe. Just to quickly go over them, we have the Robotics Engineer Artificer, the Gunzerker Barbarian, the Bardic College of Journalism, the Atom Domain, Druid Circle of the Sentinel, the Survivalist Fighter, Way of the Machine Fist Monk, the Sacred Oath of the Techno Knight, the Tribal Warrior Conclave, the Raider Rogue, the Atomic Mutant Sorcerer, a new otherworldly patron, the Whispers from the Deep, and the Arcane Tradition of Science! So in the interests of time, I decided not to make any specific Fallout-related backgrounds, as by default the player can simply customize them anyway. It shouldn't be that difficult for your players to reflavor an existing background to fit the Fallout universe and just choose whatever skills or languages they want, but once I have more time I might go back and make a few up just for the hell of it. One thing I did do though is incorporate the concept of traits into the game. In every Fallout except for 3 and 4, you could select a number of special traits when creating your character. Each trait had both a benefit and a drawback, so you had to think carefully about what kind of build you were going to go for, so as not to screw yourself over. There were also a couple traits that didn't really do anything major, so if you weren't sure what you wanted, you could just pick those. In my adventure, I decided to allow players to choose 2 traits instead of a background benefit. This might prove to be a mistake. I based all of the traits on the ones that appeared in the Fallout series, and I'm definitely going to have to go back and do a few balance tweaks after my first session. As for feats, I could have gone a lot more in depth into this than I did, but since I'm starting at level 1 and only one of my players is a human, I decided to hold off on making a bunch of feats to replicate the perks in the Fallout series. The few perks I did make were mostly to enable certain racial options like glowing ghouls, nightkin, and coursers that would have been too powerful to include as a basic race option. I also tossed in a couple other feats like the Black Widow / Lady Killer perk. As previously mentioned, I'll probably do a dedicated video on this once I get a better feel for how my house rules work in-game. Pretty much every gun is capable of one-shotting a PC at first level if they roll high enough, so I would advise restricting the first few sessions to mostly melee critters like rad roaches and feral ghouls, unless you want your players to burn through character sheets like Mama Murphy does drugs. I did have some raiders with pipe weapons in my game, and 2 of my players did drop to 0 from a lucky shot, but nobody died. One question I struggled with was how granular I wanted to get with the weapons. Most Fallout games include a wide variety of different weapons that fall into a few general classes, like pistols, bolt-action rifles, shotguns, assault rifles, and so forth. Fallout New Vegas has almost 100 different types of weapons with all the expansions installed, and that's not including the unique variants of each weapon. It would have taken me ages to stat out all of these different guns, and most of them probably wouldn't be that much different from others, as they mostly just differ in things like spread, DPS, and critical hit multiplier that wouldn't really convert to D&D. There's also a much larger range of damage values in the Fallout games than in D&D, where the difference between the weakest weapon and the strongest weapon in the game is only about 5 points of average damage. Ergo, I decided to stick to just basic archetypes like semi-automatic pistol, revolver, shotgun, assault rifle, and so forth. I also included a laser and plasma version of pretty much every weapon type, as well as a few of the more iconic weapons like flamer, missile launcher, Gauss rifle, and Fat Man. This provides a basic framework I can use to add more specific weapons to the game, like a Bozar, HKMP5, or a P226 Sauer, while not bogging things down with page after page of weapon tables. I didn't add any melee weapons, since I figured there would be enough of those in the base game already. Most of the melee weapons in Fallout are things that can be easily reskinned. Combat knives are daggers, Chinese officer swords are long swords, revolutionary swords could be rapiers, etc. Anything unique like a shish kebab or a ripper can probably be handled like a magic item, or otherwise unique variants that just add minor benefits to the standard melee weapons in D&D. For defensive gear, the main thing I did was take the types of armor from D&D and for the most part just reskin them. For instance, a leather jacket is equivalent to leather armor in D&D, combat armor is equivalent to a breastplate, and Tesla armor is full plate. The major change I made was adding damage reduction values to all but the weakest armors. The values are split into ballistic damage and energy damage, with some types of armor giving better protection for one kind of damage than another. I also added power armor to the game. It pretty much works exactly the way it does in Fallout 4, more like piloting a vehicle than wearing a traditional suit of armor. Like in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, however, it requires special training to use properly as a way of balancing out the benefits. It also runs on fusion cores, so as the DM I can decide how liberal I want to be with handing those out. I created a feat that allows a player to gain power armor training, and the Paladin subclass I made gets power armor proficiency for free at level 3. I also added grenades and chems, as well as a table with different types of ammo in case the characters want to buy more. One major thing I added to all equipment was, as previously mentioned, durability. Every time you take damage or take the attack action, your armor or weapon's durability is reduced by 1. If it reaches 0, the item breaks and provides no benefit until it's repaired. As in the games, repairing an item requires you to have spare parts as well as the right tool proficiencies, which I use instead of a repair skill. Okay, so this is a pretty big issue, and how you deal with it is going to have a big impact on your game. Now, obviously, there isn't any magic in Fallout, but there are some low-key supernatural elements in the series. There are, of course, the Lovecraftian overtones in places like the Dunwich Building in Fallout 3 and the Cabot family in Fallout 4. There is the Zetan aliens, characters with psychic powers of clairvoyance, or the Master's psionic attacks in Fallout 1, and other elements that are common in the pulp sci-fi genre that the Fallout series commonly draws inspiration from. That being said, there's nothing that even comes close to the kind of overt magical abilities that are common in D&D. The easiest and most obvious solution is simply ban any character class that uses magic. So pretty much every player has to be either a barbarian, a fighter, a rogue, or arguably a monk, not including the various subclasses that gain spellcasting, of course. This is certainly doable. Stimpaks and other healing items would need to be more plentiful to make up for the lack of cure spells, but there's no real reason you couldn't go this route. It might be an interesting challenge to see how diverse of a party you can build with just 4 classes to choose from, and some of those classes do have options for healing, like a battle master with the rally maneuver or a monk that takes the way of mercy. That said, you can probably guess from what I said earlier in the video that this is not the option I chose. Instead, I allow my players to use magic, but introduce the caveat that all of their magical abilities have to be reskinned to fit in the Fallout universe. So Cure Wounds is injecting a Stimpak, Thunderwave is a Sonic Disruptor, Fireball is an Incendiary Grenade, Invisibility is a Stealth Boy, and so forth. Anything that can't be reasonably reflavored as tech or the abilities of a Psyker is off limits, which handily removes certain problem spells like Polymorph, Plane Shift, or Conjure Woodland Beings. I prefer this approach to just straight up banning magic because it encourages the players to get creative and get immersed in the setting, rather than just limiting their options arbitrarily. Now, it might be the case that your players try to come up with justifications for spells that just don't quite fit the lore or the direction you want the campaign to go. Goodberry, for instance, would completely destroy the idea of a survival-based adventure, as would the Outlander background. As such, it's still perfectly reasonable to ban certain select spells or other features that would break the game you're trying to run. Just make sure you let your players know about this beforehand so they don't build their character expecting to be able to do something you're not going to allow. I mean, this is basically true of any game that involves a lot of house rules. You always want players to buy into the experience you're trying to create, rather than springing things on them mid-session. Now, the issue of magic items is much easier to handle, since as DM, you have control over what, when, and where players find them. As with spellcasting in general, it is perfectly within your rights as DM to just not use magic items in the game at all. I would advise against using monsters with resistance or immunity to non-magical weapons if you do this, at least not without supplying them with some other way of bypassing this resistance. For example, you could describe the floor the monster is standing on as slick with spilled motor oil, and then mention that the room is lit by barrels full of flaming garbage. You could have them fight a mirelurk in knee-deep water, and also mention a nearby computer terminal with some frayed wires that occasionally shoot out sparks. This can encourage the players to think outside the box, but it could also be more work on you. And the one that I decided to use is just do what you do with magic in general and just flavor it as advanced technology. There's plenty of ways you can use sci-fi technobabble to justify armor and weapons with unique abilities, especially if you take Fallout 4's legendary items as an example. How exactly does this pair of boots cause enemies to freeze when attacking me in melee? Laser cooling, or liquid nitrogen capsules, or science-y things. Just like with spells, though, I would advise keeping a close eye on what the items you hand out actually do. I would highly recommend making up your own random loot tables instead of using the ones in the DMG if you don't plan on just hand-picking every item your players find. If anybody is interested, I can include some examples of legendary items represented as magic items when I do the video on equipment that I mentioned earlier. If you'd like to see that or have any suggestions about what items you'd like to see, let me know in the comments. There's not a lot to cover here that doesn't apply to almost any homebrew campaign, and especially if you've watched my Elder Scrolls videos. The same basic advice applies here. In the Fallout universe, most of the enemies your players are going to come across will be either mutated animals or hostile humanoids. This makes things way easier than in a TES game, because pretty much all you have to do for most creatures is just use the stat blocks in the Monster Manual or Monsters of the Multiverse and just describe them as Fallout beasties. Yao Guai are brown bears, mirelurks are giant crabs, rad scorpions are giant scorpions, giant rats and wolves are just giant rats and wolves. For humanoids, you can pretty much just take standard NPCs like bandits, guards, thugs, and tribal warriors and just replace their weapons with guns. Their AC probably doesn't need to change, and you can just describe the armor they're wearing in more setting-appropriate style. For super mutants, you can just use orcs or ogres and give them guns and immunity to radiation. For feral ghouls, I use the statistics for zombies, only with a 30-foot movement speed, and give them the pounce trait instead of undead fortitude, and then give them a bite attack to go with it. For something like a Deathclaw, you can use a bullet and remove its burrow speed. There are some monsters that would probably require a unique stat block, but even then you can just find an existing monster that's similar enough to what you're looking for and swap traits and attacks around until you get what you want. One fun thing you can try is look up the types of wildlife that is common to your part of the world and use those as the basis for determining what creatures to stock your game world with. For instance, if you live in New York State, then Yao Guai, wolves, mutated bobcats, various kinds of mirelurks, giant whelks, mutant snapping turtles, and radstags are more than appropriate. You could even have your players fight a ghoulified plesiosaur in Lake Champlain, or make up your own Jersey Devil to be the source of the cryptid myth, like Fallout 76 Snallygaster, Mothman, and Flatwoods monsters, etc. Well, that's it for this video. I'll have more videos on this campaign in the future as I get playtest feedback from my group and get some more time to rework the rules that I've made up. In the meantime, let me know in the comments if you tried to run a Fallout campaign, either D20 based or some other game system. Also let me know what other kinds of content you'd like to see, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. If anyone is interested, and I can also upload a video going over a synopsis of the Fallout adventure I'm currently running. I just wrapped up the first session this weekend, so I can give you a general rundown of what happens week to week. If you'd like to see that, leave a comment below. Links to my other videos and DM's Guild products will be in the description. Once I've playtested the homebrew material I made for this adventure, I'm planning to rebalance it and publish what I can on the DM's Guild, so keep an eye out for that as well. Until then, just remember that war never changes.